Thank you, everyone, for attending tonight's session on wildland fire preparedness and awareness with Trent Lakes Fire Rescue and the Ministry of Natural Resources. I'm going to keep it short, and I'm going to turn it over to Ken Cox from the MMRF. Go ahead, Ken.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Chief. It's a pleasure to be here to speak to all of you here from Trent Lakes and foster and speak to our partnership that we have from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry with Trent Lakes Fire Service. So it's a pleasure to speak with you all. I hope you're having a good evening and the storm, wherever you are, doesn't hit you too hard tonight. But my title is the Southern Region Fire Advisor for the province of Ontario. So for all of Southern Ontario, which you can see behind me in the map, 273 municipalities and lots of landmass in there. I get to educate and speak to wildland fire to all folks in Southern Ontario. So my branch is the Aviation Forest Fire Emergency Services branch of the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and that's my sole knowledge of. I get to work a little bit with conservation officers, a little bit with Fish and Wildlife once in a while in the blue moon, but my sole role is wildland fire management in the province of Ontario. And so if you have any questions about, bass regulations or anything like that, unfortunately, I won't be able to shed too much light on them. But tonight we're going to talk about wildland fire. Pretty hot topic, if no pun intended. But with the busy fire season in 2023, it shed a lot of light on wildland fire and wildland fire management across Canada, across Ontario, and locally in Southern Ontario. And that's what I'm here to talk about. That's why Steve invited me to speak to you all tonight. So when I start off, I like to talk about the province. I like to show the map of how we lay out wildland fire response in the province of Ontario. North of the squiggly black line, down in the south on the bottom side of your screen, it defers what is inside the fire region of Ontario. So north of that squiggly black line is called inside the fire region of Ontario, and that's legislated through outdoor burning guidelines through the Forest Fire Prevention Act. So many of you on the call might be north of that line or have cottages north of that line. Not only do you have to abide to your local First Nation Band Council or your municipal fire authority, you also have to abide to the provincial legislation of outdoor regulation and the Forest Fire Prevention Act. If you're south of that line, the Forest Fire Prevention Act, my jurisdiction, doesn't apply. It's simply your community fire department that you have to abide to, such as a municipality, and Trent Lake straddles that line. The province of Ontario is a fairly large landmass, and to provide an adequate response, the area had to be broken up to a span of control measured a system, whereas one person, such as a sector response officer, could sit at Pickle Lake, Red Lake, Sioux Lookout, any of the dots on your map. Those are fire management headquarters. So one person sits in each of these locations and strategically daily looks at the weather parameters, looks at, for that day, looks at the weather parameters for the next 5 days or 10 days outlook, and then meets the requirements for an adequate response within the red boundaries for that geographical region out of that headquarters. So I've highlighted Haliburton, not to make it too confusing, but I highlighted Haliburton down here in the south, and out of Haliburton at Stanhope Airport, we hold 12 crews, 12 ranger crews, all the pumps, the hose, and all the resources we need to respond to a normal fire load within this geographical area that you can see the red line surrounding of it. Now, that being said, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, my team of Aviation Forest Fire Emergency Services, we're not the sole entity responding to wildland fire on this landscape. There's a tremendous amount of partnerships and support that we have and we offer to other partners, and that's First Nation communities, municipalities, Department of National Defense, federal parks, local service boards, lots of other fire agencies and fire departments in the landscape of Ontario that we partner with gratefully to provide you, the taxpayer, the people of Ontario, and the people visiting Ontario with an adequate means of wildland fire protection and management. You can see here, you might be curious as to why Hearst and Cochrane's landmass is so huge. It's a huge landmass that they cover all the way up to Polonik on the south shore of Lake Hudson and all the way down to the Cochrane area. And to put it into perspective, they have 12 crews as well. So the 12 crews here respond to the normal fire load in this area that's threatening human value. The difference is here in Southern Ontario and Haliburton, whenever a wildland fire occurs in the Haliburton sector, the blown up version on the right-hand side of your screen, it's almost always threatening something of human value, whether it be timber supply, It might be private land, it might be a hydro line right away, it might be a CN or CP rail right away. Usually when wildland fires are occurring down the south, they're always threatening something of human value, so we have to suppress them. Vice versa, up in the north, up north of Cochrane, there's quite a few communities scattered throughout the north, but there's a large landmass there where it's not fiscally responsible to suppress every single wildland fire that occurs. So we let a lot of the wildland fires burn freely up in those large areas, purely because of their impacts to humans. So that's why the geographical regions are broken up like that, and that's how we're laid out to provide you an adequate response. Now, if you call 911 to report a wildland fire in the municipality of Trent Lakes, I've highlighted our agreement map. And this agreement map is what Steve and the Trent Lakes Fire Department, as well as the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, has pre-planned for the event of a wildland fire on whose primary response it is. So when a wildland fire occurs, where I've highlighted up here, the top button that's highlighted, the top red portion, that's a wildland fire that if it occurs and you report it, its primary response is the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. And when we plug it into our database, we automatically know who's got to go to it right away. And then we notify the other partner to say, hey, Steve, we're responding to a fire within your jurisdiction. We'll give Steve an accurate rundown on what the fire's doing. We call it a scouting report. And then we'll let him know if there's any problems anticipated or if we need any assistance, and vice versa. When Steve responds and Steve's team, Trent Lakes Fire Department, gets a 911 call and they're responding to a fire and it's in the hashed mark section here on your screen, that lets them know that they're primarily responsible for it. And he still does that call. His team, or if Steve's away on vacation and whatnot, his team will still make that call to our office and we'll make sure that we're supported either way. So the good thing about this is when you call 911 to report a wildland fire, you don't have just one agency responding like a number of other communities do across the province. Here in Trent Lakes and most of Southern Ontario, you have two agencies responding. You got the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry that has it on their radar, and then you also have Trent Lakes for any wildland fire calls that come up. A lot of people ask me what I do all winter, and all winter it usually entails the agreements of this and taking place of who looks after what the costs are, and all those attributes to make sure that when fire season comes, we're ready to do our best and respond accordingly. What does the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry offer to that table? Well, we offer a lot of aviation assets, hence in the name. And so some of our aviation assets here are the Twin Otter water bomber, such as this is a photo taken at Centennial Lake last year. Some of you might have heard it on the call up by Calabogie. It's called Pembroke 1 officially. And this is a Twin Otter water bomber. It comes along, scoops off the waterway, does a circuit over top the perimeter of the fire, drops its load out of the pontoons, and reduces that fire intensity. Additionally, we have CL-415 water bombers. That's a heavy class water bomber that we have and use Ontarians. You own 9 of them. They're always operational throughout the fire season on rotational basis. Some of them are on for maintenance, some of them are on for fire attack, and other ones are on for blue alert. And it just depends on the severity of the fire rating based on the weather. But these CL-415s, they don't extinguish fires like a lot of people think. What they do and what their core job is making the firefighters safe. So they're making Steve's team and the Trent Lakes Fire Department folks safe by coming over the fire, dropping its load to reduce that intensity, to reduce the fire's intensity to a state that firefighters like Steve or I and our teams can then follow up on the edge and nozzle it out with hand tools and water pumps. You can imagine, you're looking at this photo right now, the CL-415. This is taken out of Kenora in I think this was 2016, but anyway, don't quote me on it. But you got 90-foot flame lengths there, and can you imagine standing beside it? You can't. So what the water bomber's role is just to reduce that intensity to a state where the boots on the ground firefighters can extinguish it and surround it and put it out with pumps and hoses and hand tools. We also come equipped with rotary wing assets, so helicopters. The helicopters that Ontario owns and operates are the EC-130 Eurocopter. You own and operate, or sorry, you own as Ontario taxpayers 7 of them. They're incredibly important to our operations. If you can think back to that map I just shown of the province of Ontario, and you've seen Haliburton and that large geographic area, Well, if CFB Petawawa calls and they need assistance over on CFB Petawawa over by the Ottawa River, and then all of a sudden Chief Jack Burt calls over on the other side of the province, over on North Bruce Peninsula, that's far too long of a ways to drive a fire truck, which we do have. We do have fire apparatus, but the helicopter enables us to get an incident commander and a fire ranger crew there within about 40 minutes across the sector. And that stands true for most sectors, except for, of course, Cochrane and the far north sectors, which have a lot more flight time. But for down here, down the south, our flight turnaround time for Trent Lakes would be about 28 minutes from the time of dispatch to the time of arrival. And that's all based on a one strike concept. So one strike concept for us is we have a crew on a helicopter. When somebody calls 911 and we spool up that helicopter and send it to them, the incident commander goes overhead, identifies exactly where that fire is, what it's burning in, what threatens or what values are threatened, and then they'll land and come up with a tactical plan to suppress that fire down here in the south. Oftentimes, that more often than not involves mutual aid, mutual response with Trent Lakes as an example, or any other municipal fire service or First Nation fire service as well. The helicopter doesn't just allow us to get there on time, or doesn't just allow us to get there very quickly. It allows us to also have an eye in the sky platform to do that scan report and see where the fire is and make sure that we're making the best appropriate response decisions necessary for your best interest and for the forest ecology's best interest. Ministry doesn't just use yellow helicopters. We also have a tremendous amount of other helicopters that come on contract with us. So here you have a Bell 212 medium helicopter. We'll hire on a tremendous amount of shapes and sizes and types of helicopters all fire season long, based on the fire load of how many fires are occurring in the province. We'll just hire on more to match that load, and then lay off as many as required to match that fiscally, to be fiscally responsible across the province. Here you see the Wildcat helicopter, and it's unloading the crew, textbook style, right next to a swamp or a pond or a lake. The crew's unloading. You can see here in the photo all the fire suppression gear. The nice thing about some of these helicopters is they also come equipped with belly tanks. So this one here does have a belly tank on it, and after it drops off the crew, this Wildcat helicopter is going to drop its intake, suck up about 250 gallons of water, go over the fire's edge and drop it on the fire's edge in front of the crew, making progress on the ground. And it's a very effective firefighting apparatus, aerial asset to us and our team. It makes our team very safe. So that's who I am. That's my team. That's the tools that we bring to the province and to our partners like Steve here for Trent Lakes. Steve has called us on numerous occasions to do scan reports to assist them, and vice versa. We've called on Steve to assist us on some hard to reach fires, and it works very well. But what does that all mean? It doesn't mean anything if we don't get fires on the landscape. So I'm going to switch up gears completely, and we're going to talk about fire now. So I talk about 2021 because 2021 is a key turning point here, or a key important year in terms of wildland fire management and wildland fire load on the landscape. In 2021, we saw the most hectares burnt since 1995. In all, it was just under 800,000 hectares. So if you can think of 800,000 hectares, it's actually the size of, wrong way. It's actually a little bit bigger than the size of Algonquin Provincial Park's landmass in the province of Ontario, which is a fairly large landmass to be consumed by wildland fire. In all, the 1,200 wildland fires that we responded to, 78% of them were lightning caused and 22% of them were human caused. Of those 22% human caused, that encompasses everything human related. So it encompasses trees on power lines, unattended campfires, structure fires that spread to the bush and engulf the forest or let the forest be consumed. You name it, criminal intent, arson, all classify as human caused. Every fire gets investigated and a cause is determined for each wildland fire, including, of course, the lightning caused fires. An interesting stat here that you might see is that in all, about 1,000 fires were fully suppressed. So down here in the south, absolutely fully suppressed fires. Up in the north, we had just over 140 of them that we either modified or monitored response. So we allowed those fires to burn to conduct their natural ecological cycle in the landscape, which is pretty key for us. In 2021, we saw international partners from Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, you name it. A lot of partners internationally came and assisted Ontario in our firefighting endeavors. So that being said right there, it's important to note before I move on that Wildland Fire is a very mobile agency. So we partner with not just Canadian provinces and territories as well. If BC's heating up and Ontario's wet, we'll send adequate resources over to supply them with for their fire load, which is a regular occurrence for us. Same as Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. Actually, our crews just got back from Manitoba, I think last week or a week and a half ago. Northwest Territories, you name it. We've been to Prince Edward Island for storm cleanup, Nova Scotia, Quebec, and everybody else has been all over the place, all over Canada as well. That also includes international assets. So you can also look at the states, Oregon, Montana, Idaho, all the way down into California. We've had California crews up in British Columbia on numerous occasions, and then of course broadening that out to other countries like Mexico. Mexico is a huge provider for Canada and Ontario in terms of wildland firefighters. If we get to that state where there's that much fire on the landscape, France, Costa Rica, South Africa, I could go on and on. There's a tremendous amount of other agencies out there that supply us with support. And in 2019, we were able to supply Australia with support as well, with their unfortunate turn of events for their wildland fires that they had on their landscape in 2019. Here's a map of Ontario in 2021 to show all those fires that occurred. Predominantly, they occurred in the Northwest. That's mostly due to their conifer fuel type, their forest, the boreal forest up in that neck of the woods, the north part, basically from Temagami across to Manitoulin Island and north, Sault Ste. Marie North is predominantly a black spruce, white spruce mixed forest it's much more volatile than the forest down here in Southern Ontario, but it also has a huge impact in terms of the weather. And the weather in 2021 was giving cool, dry Arctic air down from the prairies in North Manitoba that fueled these fires in Northwest Ontario. In 2022, even though the global temperature and the charts were still a warmer season than average, whatever title you want to put on climate cycles or climate change, you have two effects here of that happening. When you get heating of this area, you're surrounded by Great Lakes here in central and southern Ontario. When you heat those water bodies up and you have mass increases in temperature, that can also build thunderstorms. And that's what happened a lot in 2022. We started off with a record-breaking spring. We had numbers that I hadn't seen in my humble 16 years, 17 years now, sorry, of fire service that I'm going into. The ISIs were off the chart. The spread indexes and the fine fuel and the relative humidity was just explosive to say the least in terms of a spring hazard. But what happened is once we get that June flush up of green herbaceous material and fresh growth that we have down here in the deciduous forests of Southern Ontario and Central Ontario, we got huge humidex values. And for the remainder of the season, the RH was up and we were getting torrential downpours for every other week throughout the rest of the season. So even though it was a hot season, we didn't get much fire on the landscape because of those rain events and precip events. A key note here to think about is that wildland fire, although it is driven by temperature, it's also imperatively driven by relative humidity. If the relative humidity is the amount of moisture in the air is very low, aka that means that the air is very dry, that's more fire growth inductive than a hot temperature. And the reason why, for some cases, is that when you have a high temperature here in Southern Ontario, in our small geographic region down here in the south, when we have high temperatures in July, it's usually often followed by high humidex values. So there's a lot of moisture in that air parcel. It might be 30 degrees out, but you're sweating before you can even walk your dog 100 feet down the road. The RH might be 60%. That's not conductive to extreme fire behavior or high fire behavior, but what is in the springtime, that cool but dry air. So you might only have a temperature of 5 degrees, but if the air is very dry, it's got like a relative humidity of 20%, it's much more volatile and it will allow much more fire growth on the same fuel types. In the springtime, there are also dead fuel types as compared to flushed out June and summer conditions that we have now for deciduous and grass species. That's why 2022 wasn't a busy season. 2023, hot on everybody's radar, hence why I'm probably here to speak to you all about, and Steve invited me to speak to you all. So in 2023, Canada saw record-breaking fires across the nation. To put into perspective, Canada typically has about 4 million hectares consumed on average per fire season. Last year, they seen just over 18.4 million hectares consumed. So a lot more fire on the landscape than traditionally seen, and that went for all across Canada. For Ontario specifically, we were just above average. By no means as busy as 2021 locally for the province, but still a very busy fire season for us in 2023, just above average. So what does that mean? Well, wildland fire, a lot of folks think about the burning and the loss of homes or the forests, right? But I'm here to tell you that that's one attribute of wildland fire. The other attribute of wildland fire is the smoke impacts. And I'm pretty sure everybody on this call, there's 31 folks on this call. I'm pretty sure everybody can attest, if you can think back your clock to June 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th of last year. Actually, what day is it? Yeah, it's June 5th right now. So 365 days ago, you were under a heavy smoke impact from northern Quebec and northern Ontario. I'm going to show you why, because I get questioned on that all the time. And it probably sticks out still in your minds, so that smoke impacts that you would wake up to, and it was so hazy and smoky out, right? Well, what happened is after Halifax, unfortunately, Nova Scotia and in the area south of Halifax had those wildland fire events that unfortunately burned down just over 150 homes. A low pressure system settled over top of them over the Maritimes. And that low pressure system, you can see the arrow on your screen, pulled and drew down. Actually, I'm going to get my little device here, my spotlight. It pulled the cool, dry Arctic air, the northern air, and pulled it down, drew it down to southern Ontario. What that did is it did two things. It fueled these fires in northern Quebec and some fires in northern Ontario, you can see here, with cool, dry air that allowed those fires to burn in those fuel types more aggressively. And then it also pushed all that smoke right down into, you guess it, southern Ontario, northern states. Hence all the smoke complaint calls and the poor air quality that we experienced last year. Typically, when these fires are occurring, and typically they are occurring in the north every fire season, the winds aloft travel out the smoke and push the smoke out over top of the Labrador Sea, never to be seen again, and never to impact anything of any humans, especially southern Ontario. So that's why you had such a heavy impact of smoke down in southern Ontario last year, and it's something to think about for our future. Will it happen again? I can't tell you. It's all up to the whim of the weather. And we're going to talk about weather a little bit here right shortly. Let's see if I can still click it. No, I just got to take off my normal panner. Here we go. So that being said, it's incredibly important that I speak to the positive effects of wildland fire, because as much as it's negative to us as human species, it's positive to almost every other species that calls this great landmass home in one way or another, either directly or indirectly. And I took this picture in 2021 showing the Kenora 51 fire. It was up near the Manitoba border. The Manitoba border runs on the left-hand side of your screen, and that's about 25 kilometers of flame front backing towards that Manitoba border. But what you see in the picture in terms of a wave of fire isn't what's actually happening. What's happening here is you have tons of swamps and lakes and low-lying areas, poplar stands, and diverse terrain that affects how the fire burns. So the fires burn up to the lakes, die out, and then it's got to re-jump over the lake if it wants to continue on, right? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. When a fire burns, it's creating different mosaic patterns of intensities as it burns. Some areas will be super hot and scorched. Other areas won't barely get burned at all. And that's what the ecosystems thrive on for Ontario in the boreal forest. Additionally, you look at fire return frequency over years, and this this picture shows that perfectly. Actually, I'm going to show I like this new platform that Steve's using here. It's pretty cool. So in 1980s, there's a burn that happened here that I'm highlighting with my red arrow, and it's hard to see in the photo. My apologies, but it is there. In between here is old growth forest. I don't know when the last time it burned. I don't have record of that on my files, but we do have a 2012 burn here on the right-hand side too that you can see a little bit better because it's less forced succession change. And then you have the new fire coming. So here you can see that pattern developed over a 35-year cycle in terms of an old fire that's now regenerated up to allow certain species like the Kirtland's warbler, like that little bird, to allow it to nest and breed. It only nests in that species of trees that needs fire, jack pine. A jack pine stand of about 25 years to 35 years of age. It needs that to nest in. I don't know why. I don't speak Kirtland's warbler, but that's important for us to recognize. If we eliminate fire on the landscape, in 25 to 35 years, effectively, you'll eliminate that little bird's nesting habitat, which is really important for us to consider as humans and the best interest of the wildlife, right? Also, you have the 2012 burn that is still very much so an open canopy. It still very much so has green herbaceous growth, and that benefits food for omnivores and herbivores such as your woodland caribou down here in the south by Bancroft, your elk, your moose, and your bears and your deer all across Ontario. Lots of species benefit from that disturbance of wildland fire coming through, opening up the canopy to allow fresh growth up and browse. But then you also have the thermal cover of the old growth forest. So that's how fire's incredibly important for the landscape and a wide array of species that call it home. It doesn't just destroy the forest, it basically starts it fresh again. And at each stage of disturbance, from day one after a fire occurs, it's food and habitat for a variety of species up until it becomes old growth again. And that's how all the species evolved to live with fire on the landscape. Pretty fascinating stuff. I like it. I'm a nerd about it, but it's important for us in wildland fire management to recognize that. But we're not here to speak to that so much. We're here to speak to Fire Smart and wildland fire, how it grows and how unfortunately we lose structures every year to wildland fire. And that's what I'm going to teach you about for the next 35 minutes. I'm 5 minutes ahead of schedule. This is great. To do that, we're going to start from scratch. Some of you on the call might have an advanced idea of wildland fire, but some of you might not. So I'm going to start from scratch and get everybody on the same page. Wildland fires start and exist because of three elements coming together: heat, oxygen, and fuel. And a heat source could be a lightning strike if the fuels are dry enough, which we are right now. Right now in central Ontario, we have a fire rating that identifies the ground is lightning receptive. So we'll see what this storm brings. If this storm brings nothing that we're going to get tonight, but lightning across the region, we will certainly anticipate a lot of fire starts tomorrow. If it brings with it rain, then we won't anticipate fire starts with it. But in it all, if you got a heat source, such as a lightning bolt, a cigarette butt under extreme conditions, unattended campfire, an arsonist for criminal intent, whatever applies heat to the fuel, if it's dry enough, it will combust when it combines with oxygen. So as humans, we're not going to change the oxygen atmospherical content. I hope not anyway. And you can't always prevent heat from happening. Even if you have a perfect prevention record, aka not one person ever leaves a campfire unattended and you never have a human start, we're always still going to see lightning caused fires in the landscape. And you combine that with fuel when it's dry enough, you'll have the beginnings of forest fire. Once a fire starts, it behaves on the environment around it, and that's the fire environment triangle. It's topography, weather, and fuel driven at that point. Topography is pretty simple. Fires burn faster upslope than they do downslope, and why that is because of the convection heat that a fire projects to preheat fuels ahead of it as the fire moves upslope. That heat that it's releasing is also preheating the fuels ahead of it, and so it accelerates fire growth up the slope. Vice versa down the slope. If a fire starts at the top and tries to go down, it can't preheat the fuels beneath it as fast, so it slows its spread rate down, going downhill. For weather's a huge influencer on wildland fire, and it changes every minute, every hour, every day, and it's very difficult to forecast when you're looking out long range. But short range, we're pretty good at predicting what the weather is going to give us. And then you look down here again in fuel. So fuel and fuel, two common denominators on the fire triangles. That's how wildland fire agencies and of course the municipal fire department, Steve's team, that's how we suppress fire. We eliminate fuel. We either wet it down to the point where it's non-combustible, or we separate it from the flaming edge. And you eliminate fuel from both triangles. You either eliminate the fire from existing, or you change the way it burns if it's burning. And that's what we're going to talk about, and that's what you can do to help us in your future endeavors. But first, we're going to talk about weather, because it's super imperative here for you all to understand. This is a drying trend chart from 2012 that I pulled up just because it's a really good one that shows how you go from a low hazard up in the top of your screen. I'm going to get my laser pointer here again, my spotlight, sorry. And you can go from a low hazard, basically starting off after a rainfall event. And then as you get consecutive drying days where you don't get any more rain, there's 3 levels of fuels that begin to dry out. And those are your fine fuels. So fine fuel is just that. It's very fine. Pine needles, leaves, things like a paper product is a fine fuel. When they'll dry out in 2/3 of a day. So you can have your pine needles and leaves, dead leaves or dead grass, fully saturated in the morning with maybe a heavy dew. But by 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it will be combustible and support combustion in that afternoon's period, just from one drying day, 2/3 of one day. The next classification of fuels that we have is called the DMC. It's got duff moisture content, but it's a medium fuel. So it's about the size, it's all woody, dead material, about the size of your finger. And those fuels take a little bit longer to dry out. And you can see that here on the chart, and as well as coarse fuels. Coarse fuels are about the size of your forearm and bigger, and those fuels take even longer to dry out. So as you can see here on this chart, what we have is 14 days of drying before we hit this red stage. And the red stage is where the ministries put on a restricted fire zone and the municipalities have put on burn bans. That's because it's problematic control. When you get to a certain point of forest dryness, you're predicting a great amount of ignition start probability and a lot of fire starts, which can be very taxing on your firefighting resources. And to not overwhelm them, that's why we put in burning restrictions to everybody. Burning restrictions are put in place to hopefully reduce the amount of human-caused fires, while we still just deal with the natural lightning-caused fires that we can't change happening. So after 14 days of drying and 1, 2, 3, 4 days of problematic control, we got relief. We got 5 mils of rain. And what happened is that 5 mils of rain, even though it flattened out the fine fuels and gave us a low fire hazard for the next day and a half, on the 3rd day, it jumped right back up to a high hazard, just extreme in some fuel cases. And that's because, again, of the fine fuels drying out very quickly. 5 mils of rain wasn't enough to dampen the medium fuels or the coarse fuels to a state where they started from scratch again, up at the top of the screen. They got a kickstart to re-dry exponentially quicker, and only 2 days later, you're looking at problematic control again. That's why if Steve has a burn ban, the municipality, sorry, I picked on Steve all the time, but if the municipality of Trent Lakes or the municipalities all across Ontario have a burn ban in place and they don't lift them right away after a rainfall event, it's because they're consulting the future weather panels and they're seeing if that rain was enough to reduce the overall dryness of the medium and coarse fuels to allow less chance of combustion as those fine fuels dry out again in the future. It's a pretty tough balancing act. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we get it wrong. But in the long term, that's why sometimes the burn bans are in place after you get a rain event and everything seems wet. We're still looking at charts of very dry conditions underneath that. And there we go. So fuel. Enough about weather. I probably bored you all. Thanks for everybody joining. It's pretty fascinating stuff though, and weather changes on a dime. You can look today, right now, we're predicting this front to come through, we're predicting a lot of rain to come through it, but if you think back a couple slides ago, I said, well, if we just get lightning and we don't get rain, that's a completely different outcome, right? I can look out the window and in 10 minutes, I have a pretty good idea of what's gonna happen. In 4 months from now, it's very unknown. And a lot of people ask me what the 2024 fire season has in store. And to be totally truthful and honest with you, I have absolutely no idea. I'll be able to tell you in November, but we have a good outlook 3 to 5 days from now. Anything more than that, you have to wait to get to that stage to be able to forecast it more accurately to see what you're up against. So here comes fuel. So fuel in the fire triangle is incredibly important to consider, because that's the only real aspect of the fire triangles that we as humans can manipulate to change fire behavior. And if to fully understand it, let's pick a day last year. So on May 11th of 2023, last year here in central southern Ontario, out of Haliburton, we had a temp of 23 and an RH of 34. So that meant that it was a warm, dry day. There was not very much moisture in the air, and you had a wind speed of 10 kilometers an hour. So you could feel on your face, it was breezy, light trees were moving. It was just a beautiful, clear, sunny day with a slight breeze. That gives you a high fire weather index. That means that on the top right-hand side of your screen, you'll see FWI 16 high. What that means is that all the fire meters are pointed to high, and there's probably conversations of having a burn ban in place depending on other factors. If an arsonist or a tree fell on a power line, in all these 4 different states of fuel, you're going to have 4 completely different types of fire behavior in the exact same day for the exact same weather parameters, just the fuel being different. So if you drop the match in boreal mixedwood, on that day, you're looking at 4 meters per minute of growth after about an hour of building up steam, and fire intensity class 3. And what that means to Steve and I and all the other firefighters is that we're going to be working hard to suppress this fire. We're probably going to need air attack to help us. And it's going to be difficult, but we can manage it. We'll do our best, and we'll probably get on it. You look at conifer forest with the boreal spruce right beside it, same day, but you plop that match or you put that tree on a power line that started a forest fire in that fuel type, and you're looking at 9 meters per minute in fire intensity class 5. That's absolutely, you need air attack, and you need to be supported by air attack to have successful initial attack on them. Look at Splash. I don't know if Trent Lakes probably got quite a bit of derecho impacts from 2022. If not, there's definitely other storm damage and snow damage throughout your encompassing area. But Slash treats fire very differently, and here's why. If you look at the boreal spruce picture and you look down on the Slash, the difference is it's same conifer makeup. However, it's the way that the fine fuels are arranged. On the boreal spruce picture, the fine fuels are arranged vertically and horizontally all across the fire landscape that allow a fire to aggressively consume them. On the Slash fuel type, it's very broken up. It's broken up by large, coarse bowls of trees that when a fire burns those fine fuels readily, it hits the bowl of the tree and it's a micro blocker, and it stops and it trickles around that tree trunk and then catches back up again and continues on. So it's actually slows its rate of spread down. It's still very intense. These fires will burn incredibly intense, and they're incredibly taxing on our firefighters and the resources to try and extinguish, because if you can imagine on a 25-degree day, putting a 55-pound hose pack on your back and trying to climb over that blowdown, it's very taxing on your resources. It takes a lot of time requirement, and it takes a lot of application of water to be able to put out those deep-rooted fires underneath all that blowdown. That's why it's challenging for us in blowdown. Not for say the fire is more aggressive. It's burning actually less intense than it would if it was an unaltered a standing forest arrangement. Look at standing dead grass, and you're looking at 24 meters per minute. Standing dead grass is a flash fuel, and the reason why it's burning at 24 meters per minute is because of how fine the grass blade's fuel is compared to the other fuels. So a grass blade is much more finer and ignites much more readily available as compared to a pine needle. If you can think of a pine needle, it's much more dense, even though it does have chemical components to it that accelerate fire behavior. It's much more dense, and it takes just a couple milliseconds longer to preheat and ignite as compared to a blade of grass when it's dead. When the grass is green, in a greened up state like you have now in June, it's the opposite. It's actually a safety zone for our firefighters, and cured grass, aka green grass, won't contribute to fire spread. So in the springtime, Trent Lakes, as well as all of Southern Ontario, all of the province in Canada, is at a high hazard when the grasses are dead before they flush up, Once they flush up, it's a much lower hazard. Same thing goes for your boreal mixedwood up on the top left. Before the green leaf components come out, the forest floor is getting subjected to full solar radiation, and it's heating up very quickly. It allows fire behavior to travel through those canopies, or sorry, that forest floor layer with more wind speed, because there's not the broadleaf component to hold the wind back, and it gets that full solar radiation effect. Once the tree is broadleafed out, it provides a lot of shade. It's a lot cooler. It's more humid, and it doesn't allow the wind to travel through that forest stand. So what do we do about it? Well, ahead of time, we talk about Fire Smart Canada. And Fire Smart Canada is the mitigation tactics and strategies that all provinces and territories have adopted to promote to not just the fire services in terms of making communities a little bit more safe from wildland fire, but mostly the homeowners and cottage owners or property owners all across Canada. Something to be proud of. A lot of other countries follow that program as well. Fire Smart Canada is broken into 7 disciplines. First and foremost, vegetation management. So we talk about fuel. Vegetation is fuel. If you manage the vegetation, the dry fuel around a home, and reduce it, you reduce the fire behavior that will occur in the unforeseen event that a fire occurs in the future of that home's living. Developmental considerations plays a part into it. Public education is key. So it's one thing for me to know how fires unfortunately burn down homes all across Canada, but it's another thing for everybody else to know about it so you can do something about it, because I can't get to every single home, nor can I clean up every single home. It's up to the homeowners to do that, or the property owners to do that, right? Legislation comes into components. Interagency cooperation, cross-training, and emergency planning are absolutely fundamental as well, and that's what Steve's team and my team do together, as well as other municipalities and First Nation communities all across Southern Ontario. All winter long, we go through the bottom 5, 7, 6, and 7 aspects and get ready for the next year's burning period. Why are homes lost to wildland fire? It's because of 3 methods of fire transfer. Embers and sparks attribute to 90% of structural loss in Canada. And that's due to, if you could think of having your campfire, the last time you had a campfire or a bonfire, and you've seen the embers and sparks coming off them, and they probably self-ignited 15, 20 feet up in the air. Well, on a forest fire, you can imagine a large scale football field, which is 1 hectare in size fire, puts off a tremendous amount of embers and heat and convection. When it lifts that convection, that heat lifts up burning debris, that's a pine needle or small woody debris. That small woody debris will hold that ember much longer and further, depending on how dry it is, sometimes up to a maximum of 2 kilometers away. It's not very common, it's in extreme circumstances, but more often than not in Southern Ontario, about inside of 200 meters is a common spotting distance. We deal with it all the time on wildland fires. The difference here is when a wildland fire is occurring next to a community or a home, and those embers, that burning material, lands on a structure, the structure itself can still catch on fire if it's built up with fine fuels. So if it's built up with pine needles or dead leaves on the roofs, on the decks, under the decks, those embers will catch that fine fuel on fire, start a small fire that then builds, and then cause that deck to be combusted, or to be lost, and then causes the structure to combust. And that's how 90% of structures in Canada are lost to wildland fire. Direct flame contact attributes to about 8% of structural losses in Canada, and that's your large spruce trees, juniper bushes, whatnot, adjacent to a home, whereas the flames come off of them and they're so long that they're actually physically touching the home, and that heat transfers to the home that way. And extreme heat attributes to about 2% of structural losses in Canada. So that being said, Fire Smart Canada, to educate folks, there's lots of materials out there that you can get from Steve or the fire department. I'm going to send some more to as well on their fire safety days. You can learn more about it. But to teach everybody about it, and how I teach my firefighters about it, is to break down the home ignition zone, to teach folks what to look at first and foremost above anything else, and that's the immediate zone. If you can treat the first 0 to 1.5 meters away from a home to be a non-combustible area, you've just saved that structure and 90% of chances of it being lost. If you work away from that into the intermediate zone and to the extended zone out to about 30 meters, aka 100 feet from that home, you're increasing the odds 8%, then another 2% in those attributes. So the most bang for your buck, if you do anything at all after listening to me, it's just considering sweeping your deck and cleaning up underneath your deck and your rooftops of those fine fuels, and that's going to save your home 90% of the time. You might think, Kenny, those are real cute pictographs and diagrams and whatnot, but I'm here to tell you it actually does matter in real life. So in 2017, I was responsible for this bottom structure, this picture on your screen. It's a home that was subjected to a full crown fire in 2017. I wasn't able to get there in time with my firefighting resources. We had higher priorities to protect. Luckily, when these homeowners followed the evacuation order and they got out of there safely in time from the warnings and the e-alerts, but they also practiced fire smart well ahead of time, so they didn't have to worry about that attributes as they were being evacuated. What happened here, now I'm going to pull up, sorry, my laser pointer here again because it's important. Usually if I'm in person, I'm pointing to the screen, but here in the foreground, in the background, sorry, of this picture, you can see conifer trees that are just toothpicks remaining. Those are fully involved crowns of the forest that burned and were consumed. As the fire progressed closer to the home, they pruned and thinned the conifer, not deciduous, just conifer, to a point where those pine needle trees, the evergreens, the spruce, in this case, Douglas fir, they pruned them to a state where even if one tree caught on fire, it couldn't continue that growth from tree to tree to treetop. They are separated too much by a separation gap. Also, they separated the laddered fuels, so it means that the fire couldn't go from the crown anymore to crown to crown to crown. It had to drop down to the surface. There's no fuel, no fire, right? You learned that in the fire triangles. That fire can continue to spread moderate intensity, high intensity towards the structure through the forest floor and the floor of the landscape. Because you live in Canada, you can't have a rock barren landscape that you call home, right? Not unless you live in Sudbury. No pun intended on Sudburyans here. I got a lot of friends in Sudbury, so I tease them all the time about it. Anyway, as the fire progressed closer to the home, it self-extinguished. The homeowners practiced a non-combustible zone around the home, and it took care of the direct flame contact and the radiant heat. As the fire went to the home, it self-extinguished and just continued on its trajectory past the home. So they saved their own home by practicing Fire Smart Canada techniques, reducing the amount of fine fuels and fuel buildup right adjacent to the home and working outwards. The other 6 structures that I can't show you pictures of down the way, they were all perished. They were all lost on this incident. But this home did survive in this one little street. And that's all due to the homeowner. So if you've been paying attention, you might cue me up and say, well, what about ember transport, Ken? And you're absolutely bang on if you're thinking about that, because this home was absolutely plastered with burnt out woody debris embers that were embedded into the vinyl siding. They're built up on the corners, underneath the deck, on the deck, in the eaves troughs. It was covered in black burnt out embers. The reason why they didn't ignite the structure is because there's no fine fuels. There's no fine fuels to transfer their heat to ignite, to then cause the structure to ignite. So think of it this way. When you start a campfire, you can't just hold your lighter to a large log, right? You're going to run out of lighter fluid before you can cause that large log to catch on fire. What you got to do is you got to start off with paper, and then you got to do kindling, then medium-sized logs, and then that large log. If you eliminate paper and kindling from that equation, you're going to have a really difficult time starting that campfire. Same thing applies to starting a home on fire from a forest fire. If you eliminate the fine fuels, aka the paper, but in a forest fire setting, it's pine needles and leaves and small woody debris, you keep that clean of the structure, you've just eliminated the ability for that ember to transfer its heat to the structure. And that's how a lot of structures are saved across Canada, I'm happy to say. Practicing Fire Smart Canada techniques doesn't just help the homeowner, it helps us tremendously. There's a lot of good tips and tricks out there. I'm not going to go into them because I'm right on time. I don't want to take up too much of your evenings, but if you go to firesmartcanada.ca, check them out. They got recommendations on everything to do with a home, on how to make it fire safe and more resilient to the negative impacts of wildland fire. In all, these are things to stay away from. Build up a fine fuels on cedar roofs, build up a fine fuels adjacent to wood infrastructure. Try to keep your firewood not stacked against your home during the summer months or during the spring or fall. During the wintertime, obviously, you do what you got to do because we live in Canada. But in the summer, spring, and fall, please avoid stacking wood piles right up against your home. That's a good conduit for a forest fire to catch it on fire. Same thing goes here for the decks. If all the homeowner did was was sweep this deck off of all these fine fuels. That's great. Another thing they can do is consider replacing these juniper bushes, which are highly flammable because they're conifer, with a more herbaceous growth material, something like hostas. They can grow there, and it's much more flame resistant. There's tools if you get to work in the intermediate zone, working your way out. Some folks can't because they have shoreline bylaws that they have to abide by, or they have neighbors that own that property. Don't go and cut down your neighbors' properties, please. Don't tell them that Kenny said that. I'll get in trouble. But if you own the property and this interests you and it coincides with any municipal bylaws or any other species at risk parameters that you have to legally follow, then by all means you can do it. There's nothing here that says you have to do Fire Smart. It's just if you want to increase the chance of your structure surviving the passing of a fire, in case Steve's team and my team can't get there in time before the fire overtakes the structure, which happens. If you do these things, the structure will survive, has a better chance of surviving. Same thing goes for the extended zone. Lots of good messaging out there for you on the extended zone in terms of how to thin conifer trees, keyword conifer. You can have as many deciduous in there as you want. Actually, I prefer deciduous because the deciduous trees shade the understory and hold in all that, that moisture and block off the wind. But conifer trees are more susceptible to fire ignition. So if you can thin them or look at ways to just simply prune them, that's great. You don't have to remove every single conifer tree on your lot. You can very well live with a spruce, a pine, a white pine, a red pine. If you do anything at all, just prune the lower 2 meters of it. So the crown base height is about 2 meters or 1.5 meters above the forest floor height. What that does is it protects the tree from being fully engulfed. If you have branches that go all the way down like a Christmas tree right to the forest floor, and a low intensity fire comes along that forest floor, it's going to ignite that whole tree and the whole tree will combust. But if you separate the lower crown base height, about 2 meters, 1.5 meters, you separated it. The fire can't jump up that 9 times out of 10, and the fire will just burn low intensity, like in the photo I showed you a few slides back, towards the structure and not engulfing the tree. Actually protects the tree as well. A lot of trees developed that naturally, and self-pruning tactics allow them to be fire smart, such as a white pine and a red pine once they're mature and they have no lower branches. In the extended zone, if you have a home that looks like on the left-hand side of your screen, and you transfer just within 30 meters, no more than 30 meters around a structure, to something that looks more like on the right-hand side of the screen, you're taking a forest that would host an extreme or high rate of spread fire or high intensity fire to a low to moderate intensity fire, just by pruning it and keeping it clean. That's the same tactic, or that's the same outcome that we would have if a wildland fire occurred before European settlement or before we placed structures all across this landscape. So for time immemorial, wildland fires were an incredibly important part of the landscape, and we put permanent infrastructure on that. Fire departments have extinguished them, but now we're ending up with a fuel load that's different than would have been previous to that. So here, actually, in central Ontario, Trent Lakes, Muskoka region, all the way up to CFB Petawawa, the fire return frequency was every 16 to 37 years in this area. Every 16 to 37 years, you would have had a forest fire come through right where you're probably sitting, unless you're sitting on a very low, barren landscape. But on the height of lands, every 16 to 37 years, a fire would have occurred through the studies that were conducted. Pretty fascinating. So I'll leave you with this. FireSmart doesn't just help you, the homeowner, have a home to come back to, so you don't have to deal with insurance claims for the next 2 years. It also helps us, the firefighters, better protect it. We will do our best to get there on time due to how fast we get called and how fast we can get there. When we have a large-scale wildland fire encroaching human values, and we can't suppress it because it's just too intense, which you'll see on the news, especially in Northwest Territories, Alberta, BC, Northern Ontario. We put up values protection. We put up sprinklers or exposure protection. Steve has monitors for Trent Lakes Fire Services, Fire Department, that will set up and will spray down, will curtain down the structures that are threatened, so as the embers and the heat won't burn down that structure. That being said, when I set up sprinkler kits on homes, which I do every year as a values protection group supervisor, they're only as effective as what they can wet down. I don't have time to rake and clean up under everybody's decks or to remove spruce trees from everybody's home. I just barely have enough time to put sprinklers up on the homes. So that being said, if the homeowner can do that ahead of time, that gives my sprinklers and all the fire agencies tactics and equipment a better standing chance to protect the structure. It consolidates it, and it helps us out tremendously. Lots of great tips and tricks out there on the booklets that you can get. Check them out at firesmartcanada.ca. In all, we're looking at homes that go from this, very susceptible to being lost from a wildland fire, to this is the exact same home after it's been fire smarted. And you can learn all about that from firesmartcanada.ca. You can also take advantage of the neighborhood recognition program underneath the umbrella of Steve's fire department. You don't have to get them involved if you don't want to. You can, you're more than welcome to if you want, and myself as well. But if it's something that you would just like to do as a community with a neighborhood or a cottage community, you can visit firesmartcanada.ca, check out the neighborhood recognition program. You could get a grant for up to $1,000 to help you do that. Put on a barbecue, rent a wood chipper, do all those good things, and make your neighborhood more fire safe. Through that program. If you got questions, reach out to me. That's my job. I'm there to support you on it. Other things that you can do to help us is please stay clear of water bombers when you're out and about enjoying the waterways. If you see a water bomber coming over a waterway, please just get to the edge of the water system. You can take all the photos, all the videos you want, but just please get to the side of it so we can do our job and scoop up off those water bodies. It saves us a tremendous amount of grief and response time of being able to pick up off of a close by lake. Also, you can help us by remembering that forest fires are drone-free zones. If we ever see a drone in the air, unfortunately, it shuts us right down. We cannot risk the lives of our pilots and crew on board of an aircraft to hit a drone, to have it go through a cockpit and put that plane or helicopter down into the ground. It's just much too dangerous. We will call off all aerial assets if a drone is seen within a fire's perimeter or adjacent to a fire. And we won't fly and we won't return until that drone source has been identified and they have left. There, that's it. Am I on time? Oh yeah, we got 5 minutes. Perfect. So with that, I talked about it, but visit firesmartcanada.ca for more information if you like the FireSmart Canada aspects. If you're curious, on the fire situation across the province, you can check out Ontario's interactive fire map. That's free for you to use. You can zoom in, zoom out to any areas you want. It shows you the weather hazard, and the weather hazard changes based on how dry and windy the conditions are every day. Additionally, you also have the federal fire hazard map as well. Those maps are indicating to you weather. They're not indicating to you the fuel. So just keep that in mind. With fuel, some fuel characteristics, as you just learned, are less conductive to fire behavior than other fuel characteristics. And with that, Steve, we can kick it off to questions.
Great, Ken. Thank you. I appreciate I appreciate all that information that that you're sharing with Trent Lakes. And just to let everybody know that we do monitor that every day, and we work in conjunction with the MNR on a daily basis with the monitoring and whatnot. So it's important to us, but it's also important that we're sharing all this information with the public so they can assist us. So,
Yeah.
One thing just to add would be the weather. We have a large municipality. I'm speaking of Trent Lakes only, but we have a large municipality, and we do see multiple different weather patterns. So just because one area or one hamlet gets some weather, it doesn't mean that all of Trent Lakes is getting the same weather. So just want people to remember that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. I don't actually see any questions on the chat, unless anybody has any questions I'm not seeing. Do you see anything, Jesse?
No, anyone with questions can use the raise a hand feature. Okay, I can see them coming in now. So I see J. Lloyd Greenspoon. I'm gonna unmute you now.
Okay, perfect. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I've been reading about the 2016 fire in Fort McMurray, where 2,500 square miles were burnt, and that's about 1.5 times the size of Peterborough County, and it burnt for about 1.5 years. And it was a fire of the future, although it was 8 years ago and we haven't seen one like that. But that's what we're looking at. That's a possibility here in Trent Lakes. If a fire started up in Halliburton, it could end up going right down to Peterborough. And I know what you said about fuel and that, but in that Fort McMurray fire, houses exploded. It was so hot. Uh, the vinyl siding is just going to burn. There's so much flammable petroleum product in a house, mattresses, a lot of appliances, rugs, vinyl siding. I don't want to be critical of Fire Smart, but in this climate change fire, some people are calling this era the Petrocene era because of the fires that we're going to see in the future. And I think that, not to be too critical, but a lot of this Fire Smart stuff is like arranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It's good for the householder, but it's not going to make any difference if there's a giant forest fire in Trent Lakes. So what I'm advocating is that in Trent Lakes, we think about opening up the road allowances and creating some fire breaks. I'm really disappointed in MNR's prevention programs. I don't see any fire prevention programs for the forest. I think you're focusing on the homeowner and the home, and I know that's very politically attractive, but it doesn't protect the boreal forest. The boreal forest, and up here in the north end of Trent Lakes, we're the boreal forest too. The boreal forest is the biggest forest carbon sequestration in the world. 10% of the carbon is absorbed by the boreal forest. There's no other forest like it. And I think we have a duty to protect it. And I think MNR, and I'm not blaming you, Mr. Cox. I know you're just an employee there, and this is all government policy, but I think we really got to put some pressure on the politicians in Ottawa and Toronto to realize that we can't have another situation like Fort McMurray. You know, the kids from Fort McMurray are suffering from PTSD. If they hear a helicopter, they go under the bed. There's firefighters that have become wrecks. And anyway, I probably talked enough. I think you got my point. But I just wanted to say one last thing. In Trent Lakes, the roads department might want to look at, for example, where I live up off of 121, there's a road allowance that goes all the way from the north boundary of Trent Lakes down towards Bobcaygeon. And it's a road allowance that isn't opened. And there's a road allowance pretty well every 5 lots in the whole township. And most of them aren't opened, and they would make really good fire breaks, places where bulldozers could go in. And I asked you at the last meeting about controlled burns, and that's a whole other topic that I think MNR should be doing a little more work on. You led me to the website to look at permits, but it's a bureaucracy, Mr. Cox. I don't know. I think the MNR should be doing controlled burns on behalf of the province. But anyway, those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Well, those are great thoughts. I respect every single one of them. I can't speak to Fort McMurray exactly because I got married on that weekend and I couldn't make that trip out, but my good friends did. And yeah, I can attest to the homes and to what they witnessed there in 2016. And in May of 2016 was a devastating event. Unfortunately, that event has also led to a lot of other communities that have been lost across Canada. And that's what Fire Smart Canada speaks to the most, is trying to reduce those losses through non-combustible plants being adjacent to the structures, as well as the structures themselves being non-combustible. But I respect your point 100%, and that's what makes us better, right? We are open, we hear each other, and we try to make tomorrow a better place. In essence, wildland fire is still an incredibly important aspect of the boreal forest. So up north, but we'll still allow it to conduct its natural ecological role whenever it's going to occur next to communities, First Nation communities, municipalities, you name it. What's the word? Communication towers. It's just looking at my radio, trying to think of the word for it. I almost called it radio towers. But anyway, communication towers. We'll do our best to protect them and all those attributes. And if we make them fire resilient before a wildland fire event occurs, it gives us a better standing chance to deal with it on the time of. But fully respect your opinions and all those good things. So thanks a lot for the call, and thanks for the conversation before and the prescribed burns. And yeah, hopefully we can make tomorrow a better place. I see Carol. Sorry, Jesse. Is it okay if I go to Carol? I see Carol Armstrong's hand up, and then I'll work down. I'll just work down the list that I can see on my screen. Okay, go ahead, Carol.
I'll just unmute her here.
Sorry, I really didn't have a question. I think that was an error. Apologies.
Yeah, no worries. It's all good. I'm going to scroll down here, and if I miss somebody, I apologize. I see an Ed Leardam. If you could unmute Ed, Jesse.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, I got you, Ed.
Hi, Ken. Thanks very much for that information. That's great. And Chief Brockbank for putting this on. Appreciate that. One of your earlier slides had the map of Ontario with that black line kind of underneath Haliburton area. It was really too small to see kind of where Trent Lakes is in relationship to that black line. Are you able to bring it back up, zoom it in?
I can't because of the resolution on my screen, but I can. If you see the Ontario Interactive Fire Map right on your screen right now, hopefully you can still see that. If you can't see it, just write down Ontario Interactive Fire Map. If you Google that, click on the Leo Hub website that populates. It should be like the first two banners that show up on the Google search. You can scroll right in and you can pan right into that line. Okay. All you gotta do is look on the left-hand side of the layer screen and select Fire Management Headquarters. It's a blue line tab on the layers. You select that and you'll be able to see where that line flows down in Southern Ontario. And for Trent Lakes, it does cut right through some of the municipality down there.
And that was really kind of my question is I mean, Haliburton is north of us, obviously, in Trent Lakes, and there's maybe a small portion, and I just wanted to see how much of Trent Lakes you would be looking at in your responsibility in your area.
Yeah, that's a good thing. And then I'm glad that you brought that up. So even the areas to the south, I apologize, I didn't talk about this. So thanks for prompting me on that. We still support anybody in the OFR. So anybody south of that black line, we'll still support any fire chief, any municipality, any First Nation community, any Department of National Defense south of that line. We just have a legal obligation to first and foremost protect everybody north of that line. And if we can, we'll still supply resources based on what's threatened south of that line as well. It's just not a normal occurrence. We just simply don't have the amount of call volumes for down there that they need our assistance on, that it's a regular business for us. It's pretty rare occasions that we end up down there. But yeah, Ed, does that answer your question too?
Yeah, and I think you alluded to it earlier, and thanks for that. And I do have one further question, if I may. And I can't remember which year it was, 2021, 22, 20. There was a wildfire, forest fire in the north part of Trent Lakes near Crystal Lake, I believe it was. Are you aware of that one? Can you comment on that one, the cause, how you dealt with it?
Well, I deal with a lot of them. I'm sorry, Ed, I deal with a lot of fires on a daily basis. I can't recall that one, but yeah, I can't recall that one offhand. Okay. Sorry about that, Ed.
No, that's fine. That was just the one in my memory that was closest to home kind of thing for us within what I would consider the boundaries of Trent Lakes, and it was concerning. A lot of the people in the area were concerned that it would spread, and I guess the information that you've given us helps us a lot in trying to figure out how we can best protect our assets. Thanks again. Great information.
Well, thanks for listening, Ed. I appreciate your time tonight. Thanks for joining us. Perfect. I'll scroll down here and I'll see if I can't see any more hands up. Sorry, folks, if I miss you. I'm just going down on my end. Oh, I don't see any more hands up at all. So just have a quick look there, Jesse, for me, if you don't mind, to make sure I'm not missing anybody. But I don't see anybody's hands up. So I think we're,
Nope, I don't see any hands up, so we'll just do last call for any questions for Ken.
okay, well, thanks everybody. I really appreciate you listening, because it doesn't mean anything if nobody listens to me. So I appreciate every single one of you coming on the call and hearing me out, and looking to make tomorrow a little bit of a safer place together. Thanks everybody. Stay safe, and I hope this storm finds you well.
Thank you, Ken.